Bruce Lee's name was spoken before anyone saw him, and by the end, the Muay Thai champion didn't argue, he just stopped meeting people's eyes. This happened in a closed gym with no cameras, no tickets, and no official match, only a rule whispered like a dare: elbows only. 7 seconds after it began, the room went quiet in a way witnesses still describe as unnatural. Not because of blood, because of what it did to the champion's certainty.
Bangkok, Thailand. A backroom Muay Thai gym off Rama 4 Road. June 18, 1971, Friday, 9:17 p.m. They still argue about why the lights were on that late. Not because late-night training was unusual in Bangkok. It wasn't. But because the room felt arranged without looking arranged, like a meeting that no one wanted to officially host. There were no posters, no tickets, no table at the door. The metal shutter out front was pulled halfway down, leaving a narrow gap of streetlight at the bottom. Inside, the air had that familiar mix: sweat ground into canvas, old leather, menthol from liniment rubbed into shins. A few fans turned slowly, not cooling anything, just moving the heat around. People came in quietly, in ones and twos, the way men arrive when they don't want their presence recorded. Trainers stood near the ropes. Fighters leaned against the darker walls where the light didn't reach. A couple of men dressed too clean for gym work hovered near the entrance, hands in pockets, eyes taking measurements. No one cheered. No one acted like this was entertainment. It felt like a rumor had rented the building for one night. And the rumor had a name: Bruce Lee. They say his name was spoken carefully in the days before, as if it could trigger something if said too loudly. Not the movie star, not the actor, just Bruce Lee. Spoken like a test, like someone asking if you believed your own words. Even the people who admired him didn't sound excited. They sounded cautious, like they understood what happens when a story crosses borders and lands in a room that doesn't care about stories. The challenge wasn't public, not officially, but it had become public in the only way that mattered. It had become inevitable. You could feel it in how conversations shortened, in how a trainer stopped mid-pad count and listened to the front, in how a young fighter was quietly told to stand back tonight, to stop trying to insert himself into something older men were taking seriously. The ring sat in the middle like a bright square of truth. The overhead lights made the center almost clinical. The corners, by contrast, were dim, faces half-lit, eyes bright, a spotlight effect without anyone planning it. A witness later described it in a simple line: it looked like a place where nobody wanted to be the loudest person. The first real shift in the room, though, didn't happen when Bruce Lee arrived. It happened when the champion walked in. They don't agree on his exact height. They don't agree on his exact weight. Witness accounts differ because men remember power in different numbers. But they agree on the architecture of him: thick shoulders, a neck like a column, legs built from years of impact. He moved with the relaxed ownership of someone whose reputation doesn't need to announce itself. It wasn't just his body that changed the room, it was the way the room responded. Postures corrected, voices dropped further. A chair was moved without anyone asking. Water appeared near his side like a reflex. He didn't smile for the crowd. He smiled as if the crowd was irrelevant. And yet he accepted being watched the way a man accepts weather. This was not a random gym figure. This was an authority, someone local fighters measured themselves against, someone trainers referenced by name, the way you reference a standard. The champion stepped near the ropes and looked at the canvas like it was familiar ground. He rolled his shoulders once, slow. He did not ask why the gym had filled. He behaved as if the question didn't matter.
Because in his world, the rules already existed. Then, someone at the edge of the room murmured, almost too softly to hear, "Bruce Lee." The champion glanced toward the shutter with a calm appraisal, like a man looking at a doorway that always opens eventually. Not curiosity, not excitement, calculation. When Bruce Lee finally entered, the room didn't surge forward, no applause, no celebrity behavior. People simply made space. Witnesses describe him as smaller than outsiders expected, compact, lean, about 5'7", no visible symbols of rank, plain training clothes, nothing that signaled status. He didn't carry himself like someone arriving to claim a room. He carried himself like someone arriving to finish a task. And the contrast was immediate. The champion filled space outward. Bruce Lee pulled attention inward, not with performance, with refusal. No bouncing on the toes, no showy warm-up, no exaggerated stance for the onlookers. He stood with his hands relaxed, breathing even, eyes steady in a way that didn't register as aggression, more like precision, like a person focusing on a narrow problem. A few men later said the strangest part wasn't Bruce Lee's speed or posture, it was his quiet. He wasn't trying to persuade anyone. The origin of the challenge, how it started, never landed in one clean version, because that's how these nights form, a line spoken privately, then repeated by people who wanted to mean more than it did. One trainer said it began earlier in the week in a hallway behind a different gym when someone brought up Bruce Lee in a tone that wasn't admiration, more like irritation. The idea that an outsider could be talked about so intensely without having paid the local price. Another witness said it began around film people, actors training for realism, fighters crossing into cinema work, those overlapping circles where reputations travel quickly and get embellished. But the most consistent detail is a single sentence attributed to the champion, spoken quietly, not theatrically. If he wants to test, we make it fair. In Muay Thai, elbows decide. Not a threat, not shouted, just a calm claim of territory. The sentence didn't stay where it was said. It slipped into the air, and the city carried it. By Friday night, it had sharpened into a rule that sounded less like fairness and more like a trap. Elbows only. Anyone in that room understood what that meant. Elbows don't need space. They punish closeness. They leave marks that don't look like sport. Elbows only was a way of removing comfort, of dragging an outsider into a corridor where local experience has weight. It was also a psychological frame. It told the crowd what kind of story they were about to witness, not a friendly spar, not an exhibition, but a narrow test designed to expose. When Bruce Lee heard the terms, he didn't argue. Witnesses don't remember speeches, they remember pauses. Bruce Lee listened, looked once at the ring, and stayed silent long enough that the quiet became uncomfortable. Then he gave a small nod. One witness recalls someone trying to soften it, talking about safety, about keeping it controlled. Bruce Lee's response, when it came, was brief enough to feel almost dismissive by accident. Fine. No pride, no defiance, just decision. That decision changed the room more than any swagger would have, because men who agree calmly to harsh terms don't look like they're negotiating for survival. They look like they've already accepted the math. The stakes weren't announced like a promotion would announce them, but everyone felt them. If the champion proved his rule worked, Bruce Lee's reputation would shrink inside this circle. He would become another outsider who didn't survive local reality. The whisper would die or turn mocking. If Bruce Lee prevailed under elbows only, something worse would happen for the champion, for the gym's hierarchy, for everyone's sense of order. It wouldn't just be a loss, it would be an interruption of belief.
That's why the trainers insisted on conditions that sounded like discipline but felt like containment. No cameras, no media, limited witnesses, no rounds, no prolonged exchange. One decisive moment, clean, controlled. Not because they wanted drama, because they wanted the damage, physical and reputational, kept inside a manageable boundary. They formed a ring of witnesses around the ring, trainers, older fighters, a few insiders from the film world, and quiet men who looked like they'd been invited not to speak. The bright center became brighter in everyone's mind. The dark edges became darker. A spotlight effect, a stage built out of silence. The champion stepped into the ring first, loose and confident. He moved with the comfort of someone at home, shoulders rolling, hips ready, not showy, but familiar with being watched. Bruce Lee stepped in without ceremony, no flourish, no ritual. He placed his feet as if prepared to move in any direction, not committed to one line. His hands were up, but not high. He didn't try to look intimidating. He didn't try to look relaxed. He simply looked present. Public tension in that moment didn't come from shouting. It came from the mismatch. The champion looked like a man stepping into a story he understood. Bruce Lee looked like a man stepping into a moment he had already completed privately. For the first second, nothing happened in the way people later wanted it to happen. No sudden rush, no dramatic collision. The champion tested distance, a small forward pressure, a probe to collapse space, a way to make Bruce Lee react like an outsider, either retreat, flinch, or charge straight in.
Bruce Lee did none of those. He adjusted so subtly that witnesses later argued about what moved. Some claim it was his lead foot sliding a fraction. Others insist it was a shift in shoulder angle. One older trainer said it was simply his alignment, Bruce Lee turning the problem into geometry rather than force. The champion advanced again, closer, as if confirming the range. This was his rule. This was where elbows do their work. A micro smile appeared on his face, brief, thin. A man comfortable with the corridor he had created. The crowd held its breath, not loudly, internally, the way bodies do when they expect impact. Then the champion committed, not with theatrical violence, with a practiced forward drive designed to close space and turn it into a clinch corridor where elbows are quick and hard and often unseen until they land. Witnesses say the champion expected contact, expected a trade, expected Bruce Lee to learn something the painful way. Bruce Lee didn't trade. He didn't meet force with force. He removed the line the champion was entering. It began with an angle, small, almost disrespectfully small. Bruce Lee didn't retreat backward. He moved offline by a fraction, and the champion's forward drive suddenly looked heavier because it was committed to a point that no longer existed. At the same time, close range, too close for spectators to read cleanly, a compact motion happened. Not big, not flashy, not choreography. A micro-movement, a sharp, contained action in the space where elbows are supposed to dominate. The room didn't react immediately because the brain takes a moment to understand outcomes that don't match the expected rhythm. Then the champion's face changed. Not pain first, confusion. A brief blankness, like a system receiving data it wasn't built to process. A witness later described it as if the champion's forward intention simply stopped being true. He didn't fall dramatically. That's not what made the gym go silent. He steadied himself, but his posture shifted, his breathing changed. His eyes, multiple witnesses mentioned the eyes, stopped projecting certainty and started searching, as if looking for a version of reality that still made sense. The exchange, from commitment to conclusion, lasted under 10 seconds. Most accounts returned to the same number, said with an uncomfortable consistency. 7 seconds. 7 seconds and then a silence that didn't feel like politeness.
It felt like a room realizing it had just watched authority separate from certainty, and nobody knew what to do with that knowledge. Bruce Lee did not raise his hands. He did not look to the crowd. He did not celebrate. He stepped back into neutral, as if the demonstration had been an administrative correction. A trainer at ringside, trained to spot injury, took one involuntary step forward, then stopped himself, because nothing was escalating. It was already over. The champion stayed upright. That made it worse for him. If he had fallen, the room could have turned it into a story with a clean ending. They could have blamed balance, footing, luck. They could have demanded more exchange to prove it. But standing there, under the harsh light, he looked like a man trying to preserve face while privately recalibrating. The psychological collapse began not as rage, but as narrative scrambling. The deniers spoke first, not shouting, quick, controlled attempts to restore normal rules. That wasn't elbow only. It was too short. He wasn't ready. Do it again and it changes. It was arranged.
They weren't trying to convince Bruce Lee. He wasn't listening. They were trying to convince each other. The believers, mostly trainers and fighters with quieter eyes, didn't argue much. They exchanged small looks, tight nods that said, yes, that happened. But even the believers didn't look happy. They looked unsettled, because what they had seen implied the terms had not trapped Bruce Lee, they had revealed him. And that implication created its own discomfort, because it suggested that rule sets and local certainty are not always protection against someone who arrives with a different kind of control. The most damaging part for the champion wasn't the movement itself, it was what happened afterward. He could have laughed, he could have insulted, he could have demanded a rematch in front of witnesses, pulled the room back into familiar masculinity. He didn't. He stepped down from the ring slowly, not limping, not broken, just careful in a way that suggested he was aware of being watched for the first time that night. A trainer offered him water. He took it but didn't drink immediately. He stared at the bottle like it gave him time. Someone said something to him softly, maybe reassurance, maybe an invitation to deny it. The champion nodded once, but he didn't join the denial. That refusal fractured the room further, because if the authority figure won't deny it, denial becomes fragile. Small arguments formed at the edges, quiet disputes that sounded like rule debates but were actually identity debates. A young fighter insisted it didn't count. An older trainer snapped back that it counted precisely because it ended before the corridor could become comfortable. Meanwhile, Bruce Lee did what he had done all night. He didn't speak. He moved toward the ropes, stepped out without ceremony, and walked toward the half-open shutter as if leaving a place that no longer mattered. A few men tried to follow him, not to chase, but to anchor themselves, to ask the question they couldn't ask inside their own pride. Bruce Lee didn't stop. One witness standing near the entrance later said Bruce Lee's face wasn't triumphant. It was neutral, almost tired. He exited into Bangkok's ordinary noise, and the ordinary noise did what it always does. It swallowed private moments without caring. Inside the gym, the silence lingered longer than anyone wanted, because what remained wasn't a winner's speech, it was a vacuum. And a vacuum forces people to fill it with their own explanations, their own defense systems, their own fear of what this means about them. In the weeks after, the gym returned to routine the way places like that always do. Pads were held, bags were struck, fighters ran and sparred, new students arrived with hungry eyes. If you walked in as an outsider, nothing on the walls told you what happened on June 18, 1971. No photographs, no newspaper clippings, no official record. And yet people who trained there later say the room changed, not visibly, subtly. Before that night, silence in that gym meant discipline. Listen, respect, don't talk too early. After that night, silence meant memory. The story didn't spread like scandal, it spread like a password.
A man would bring it up in a corner of a different gym months later, not as a claim, but as a cautious test. You ever hear about Bruce Lee, Bangkok? If the other man laughed, the subject would drop immediately. If the other man's face changed just slightly, the whisper would continue. The story simplified over time, as all whispered legends do. A champion, a private rule, elbows only. Bruce Lee. 7 seconds. Silence.
People who weren't there repeated those beats because beats are easy to carry. But the people who were there told it differently. They told it with discomfort, like confessing something that would sound exaggerated to anyone who didn't understand quiet skill. And the lack of footage is what made it last. If there had been film, the world would have turned it into debate. Angles, slow motion, arguments about fairness. Skeptics would have found a frame to attack. Believers would have found a frame to worship. But with no footage, skepticism had only one target, the credibility of the witnesses. And the witnesses were not one kind of person. Some were fighters who cared about mechanics, not legend. Some were trainers with reputations built on honesty. Some were film men who had seen staged violence and knew this wasn't staged because it didn't look like anything designed for an audience. Years later, the champion continued training, continued being respected. He didn't become a joke. That's not how real circles work. Respect doesn't vanish overnight. But witnesses say something shifted around him. The automatic awe softened. A thin layer of hesitation appeared in the way younger fighters talked about him. Not disrespect, complexity. Respect plus the knowledge that respect can have exceptions. And that knowledge is corrosive to dominance, because dominance relies on everyone agreeing not to question it. Bruce Lee never attached himself to the story. That detail, repeated across accounts, is what makes the whisper heavier. Most men who win privately find a way to leak it. They let it slip through friends, through jokes, through accidental mention. Bruce Lee didn't. He didn't confirm it publicly. He didn't use it to humiliate a culture. He didn't give interviews about it. He let the story belong entirely to the people who needed to carry it, which meant the champion never got a public villain to fight. You can challenge a man's words, you can argue with his explanation, but you can't box his silence.
Sometimes, new students would ask older trainers about the Bruce Lee night because they'd heard a fragment from someone who heard a fragment. The old man would shrug and say, "Stories." And often that would be the end of it. But if the student trained long enough, if he proved he wasn't there for gossip, if he learned to stay quiet at the right times, sometimes an older man would tell it properly. Not with excitement, with a flat voice, with pauses. And those tellings would always end in the same place, not with a moral, not with a lesson delivered like a speech, just a quiet line, spoken almost to the floor. He didn't celebrate. He didn't explain. He just left. That exit is why the story stayed alive. Not because it sounded unbelievable, because it sounded inconvenient. It offered no satisfying public ending, no trophy, no official record, no footage to make it safe. Only a private room, a harsh rule, a brief exchange, and a gym that went silent, not from shock, but from recognition. Years later, when the witnesses reached the 7 seconds part, many of them still lowered their voice, not because they feared Bruce Lee, because they remembered how quickly certainty can disappear when it meets control that doesn't need approval. And after they finished, they usually stopped talking, not because they had nothing more to say, because in the end, there wasn't anything else. No speech, no rematch demanded in public, no dramatic scene to quote. Only the quiet of a room realizing it had just watched something clean, controlled, and final, and the man responsible walking out as if it was never meant to be a story at all, as if it was simply something that needed doing. And then, naturally, the city kept moving. The shutter came down, the lights went off,
and the legend stayed where it began, in whispers told by witnesses who never sounded proud to tell it.